The whale was not supposed to be capable of this. Everything the men of the Essex knew about sperm whales, accumulated through years of hunting them across the Pacific, told them that the whale was prey, that it was large and it was powerful in the water but that it did not attack ships, that the relationship between the hunters and the hunted followed rules that both parties understood and that the rules did not include this. The rules did not include a whale of 80 feet and perhaps 80 tons turning in the open ocean and coming back toward a ship with the specific directed intention that the men watching from the deck would later describe with a consistency that suggested they were describing something real. The whale accelerating toward the Essex not in panic or confusion, but with a purposefulness that the word attack does not fully capture because attack implies something reactive and what this whale was doing appeared to be something else entirely, a decision, a choice, an act of deliberate violence that the natural order of things had not prepared anyone present to witness. The Essex was a Nantucket whaling ship, 238 tons, 20 years old, crewed by 20 men under the command of Captain George Pollard, Jr., who was 28 years old and on his first command and who would spend the rest of his life, which was long, carrying the weight of what happened on November 20, 1820, in the Pacific Ocean approximately 2,000 miles west of South America. The first mate was Owen Chase, 23 years old, whose written account of the disaster would become one of the foundational documents of American maritime literature and who was, by every account including his own, a man of exceptional competence and significant complexity. The crew was young, as whaling crews were, men and boys from Nantucket and from the mainland and from the Pacific Islands where the whaling ships recruited, drawn to the work by the wages and the adventure and the alternative to whatever they had been doing before, which in most cases had seemed less interesting than the sea. They had been out for 14 months when the whale found them, hunting the sperm whales of the Pacific in the established way of the Nantucket fleet, lowering the small whaleboats when the lookout spotted a spout and rowing toward the whale and harpooning it and riding the Nantucket sleigh ride of a harpooned whale running through the water until it tired and could be killed. It was brutal and it was skilled and it was the foundation of an economy and a culture, and the men who did it did not experience it as brutal, or not primarily, because familiarity changes the quality of one's relationship to brutality in ways that the unfamiliar observer cannot always understand. Chase was in the water in his whaleboat making repairs when the whale appeared. A lookout spotted a large bull sperm whale on the surface approximately 100 yards off the ship's bow, lying motionless in the manner of a whale that was not doing what whales normally did in the presence of a ship, which was to move. This stillness was the first thing that was wrong, the first indication that the normal rules were not operating, that something was happening that fell outside the established categories of the relationship between the Essex and the creatures it hunted. Chase watched the whale from his position in the water beside the ship and felt something that he later described in his account with more precision than the feeling perhaps deserved. A conviction that the whale's stillness was not the stillness of an oblivious animal but the stillness of one that was paying attention. The whale began to move. It moved toward the ship at approximately 3 knots initially, which is not fast, which is in fact a speed that a person watching from the deck of the ship had time to register and to begin to form a response to. And then the speed increased and Chase shouted a warning that was not actionable in any meaningful way, because what do you do when a whale of 80 feet is accelerating toward your ship with apparent intention? And then the whale hit the Essex with a force that the men on board felt. Through the hull and through the deck and through their feet and into their spines, the ship shuddering with the impact of something massive and purposeful striking it at speed. The damage from the first impact was significant and the Essex was already taking water when the whale did the thing that made the event not a maritime accident but something that entered the literature of the sea as a story people would tell for 2 centuries. It turned. It turned and it swam away from the ship at speed and at distance, and then it turned again and it came back and it hit the Essex a second time. This time with more speed and at a slightly different angle. And this second impact broke what the first had damaged, and the Essex, which had been a ship, began to become a wreck. Chase got back aboard in the chaos after the first impact and found water coming in at a rate that the pumps could not manage. Pollard's whaleboat came back from its position pursuing another whale to find the Essex listing and dying, and Pollard came aboard and looked at what the whale had done to his ship and at the water rising in the hold and at the men around him and said something that Chase recorded in his account. A question rather than a statement. The question of what in the name of God had happened, and the answer was the whale. Sir, the whale did this. And Pollard's response to this answer was the silence of a man whose categories are being rearranged by an experience they had not previously accommodated. They had time before the Essex went down to provision 3 whaleboats with what they could transfer from the sinking ship. They took bread and water and navigational equipment and some tools and the things that seemed most essential in the minutes available, making decisions under pressure that would later be examined for what they revealed about judgment and priority and the specific way that crisis compresses decision-making into intervals too short for adequate deliberation. They had somewhere between 60 and 90 gallons of water in total across the 3 boats. They had perhaps 1,200 pounds of hardtack. There were 20 men who needed to be fed and watered across a distance they had not yet fully calculated but that the navigation would shortly make clear was enormous. The calculation, when Chase made it in the first hours of floating beside the wreck of the Essex in a whaleboat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, was this. The nearest land was the Marquesas Islands to the west, approximately 1,200 miles away. The Society Islands were a similar distance in the same general direction. The coast of South America was approximately 2,000 miles to the east and south. The problem with the islands to the west was a problem that Chase and Pollard and the crew of the Essex shared with the general knowledge of the Pacific in 1820, which included stories, some reliable and some not, of cannibalism practiced on islands in that region. The men of the Essex, facing the choice between a shorter passage to islands of uncertain safety and a longer passage to the known coast of South America, chose the longer passage. This decision has been examined by historians and navigators and students of human judgment ever since as an example of how fear can distort rational calculation in ways that have catastrophic consequences. Because the shorter passage to the Marquesas would almost certainly have saved all or most of them, and the longer passage to South America produced one of the most terrible survival ordeals in the history of maritime disaster. But the men who made it were not irrational in the terms available to them. They were making a decision with the information they had and the fears they carried and the judgment they possessed. And the decision made sense in those terms even though the terms were incomplete. They began sailing east and south toward the coast of South America in 3 small whaleboats on November 22, 1820, 2 days after the whale attack. 20 men in 3 boats, each boat approximately 25 feet long and not designed for the extended ocean passages they were now undertaking, without the depth of hull or the breadth of deck that an ocean crossing required, exposed to the sun and the spray and the wind with the minimal shelter that a whaleboat's design provided, which was essentially none. The Pacific Ocean was already 100 days by ship from any home port. It was going to be much more than that by whaleboat. The water rationing began immediately. Each man received a fixed daily allocation that was insufficient to prevent the gradual dehydration that insufficient water produces in men working hard in the sun, and the insufficiency accumulated day by day in the bodies of the 20 men in the 3 boats, expressing itself first in the thirst that dominated conscious experience and then in the declining physical capacity of men whose bodies were running low on the fluid required to operate. The bread ration was similarly insufficient and similarly accumulated its insufficiency in the men's bodies as the days became weeks and the weeks became something that needed a different word because weeks implied a brevity that did not apply to what they were experiencing. They found Henderson Island on December 20th, a month into the ordeal, a tiny coral island that was uninhabited and whose fresh water and wildlife provided a brief and partial relief from the conditions of the boats. 3 men chose to stay on Henderson Island, making the calculation that a known island with limited food and fresh water was preferable to an unknown continued passage in an open boat. And the other 17 continued on their way and the island disappeared behind them, and the 17 men in the boats looked at the open ocean ahead and resumed the experience of crossing it in conditions that had not improved. The deaths began in January. The men who died first were those whose physical reserves had been lowest at the beginning, whose bodies had less to draw on when the drawing had been going on for weeks. Each death was a grief, and each death was also, in the terrible mathematics of the situation, a reduction in the demands on the remaining water and food, a fact that the survivors were aware of and that the awareness of was its own kind of suffering. The knowledge that the death of a shipmate eased the situation of those who remained. They buried the dead in the sea and continued, and then there was not enough food and the decision was made that no one who has not been in that situation can adjudicate from the comfort of any remove. The decision to use the bodies of those who had died to sustain those who had not yet died. And this decision was made and carried out, and the men who carried it out lived with the carrying of it for the rest of their lives, which were various in their lengths and in the degree to which the carrying was audible to others. Chase's boat was found by a British ship called the Indian on February 18, 1821, 90 days after the Essex went down. Chase and 2 other men were in the boat, the only survivors of what had been 7 in Chase's crew. Pollard's boat was found 5 days later with Pollard and 1 other man, the only survivors of its complement, having sustained themselves through the same terrible means as Chase's crew. The third boat was never found. 8 men survived of the 20 who had left the Essex in the 3 whaleboats, and 3 more survived on Henderson Island, for a total of 11 of the 20 who had been on the ship when the whale came back the second time. George Pollard returned to Nantucket and was given another ship and lost that ship too, to a reef rather than a whale, and after the second loss he never commanded a ship again but remained on Nantucket for the rest of his life, working as a night watchman, walking the streets of the town that the whaling industry had built, known to everyone and speaking about what had happened to anyone who asked with the honesty of a man who had decided that the truth deserved to be told plainly. He lived to 1870 and the people of Nantucket respected him, and the respect was not for his success, which had been limited, but for the specific quality of a man who had carried an enormous thing for 50 years and had not been broken by the carrying. Owen Chase wrote his account of the disaster within months of his return, while the details were still immediate, and the account was published in 1821 and read by, among many others, a young man named Herman Melville who encountered it on a whaling voyage of his own and who was marked by it in ways that later expressed themselves in a novel about a white whale and the men who pursued it, which is a different story than the Essex story but one that the Essex story made possible, the way real disasters make possible the imaginative structures that allow people who were not there to apprehend something of what happened. The whale that sank the Essex was never seen again, as far as the historical record shows. It returned to the Pacific and the Pacific returned it to anonymity, an 80-foot sperm whale moving through the deep water of the ocean that it had navigated before human beings had boats and would navigate after human beings, and their boats are a geological footnote. Whether it understood what it had done, whether it carried anything of the event in whatever consciousness a sperm whale possesses, is a question that the record cannot answer and that the imagination is free to consider without resolution. What it left behind was a story, which turned out to be one of the most durable things it could have left. The story of the Essex traveled through the literature and the maritime culture and the imagination of the century that followed, and it is still traveling, still being read and told and examined for what it says about the ocean and about the people who go onto it and about what happens when the thing you assumed was prey turns out to have its own perspective on the arrangement. The 20 men in the 3 boats made their passage across the Pacific, and some of them died and some of them survived, and the ones who survived came home and lived inside the story for the rest of their lives, carrying it not as a triumph, though it was that in the bare biological sense, but as a weight and a knowledge and a permanent rearrangement of how the world appeared to them, which is what genuine extremity does when it is survived. It changes not just what you have been through but what you are able to see.